All right, guys, in this next part, we're going to be going over some basic layout. We're going to need to do some rough animation of the Razor Crest landing. And this is going to be useful to you, and it's going to be useful to your supervisor or maybe even the client, so they can get a quick read to see if this shot is going to be working. So even if you are just working for yourself, it's always a good idea to establish the camera angles that you want and some rough areas where your hero model is going to be in some basic environment, just so you can understand if that is going to be worth your while continuing. So that's what we're going to be doing here. The end result is going to be pretty rough, but we will be refining it throughout this series. I also wanted to mention a quick disclaimer. As I progressed through making these tutorials, I realized that I didn't make the scene to scale. And this is pretty embarrassing. That's something that you should always do. It's definitely a noob mistake. But I was just tunnel visioned on making these tutorials and just getting on to one section to the next. Completely escaped me that I never made it to scale. So if you are interested in following along exactly, it doesn't really matter. You can still have it really small. But if you want to make sure that you are working at real world scale, I would highly recommend looking up dimensions, like real world dimensions for the Razor Crest or whatever ship or vehicle that you're using, and base your scene around that. Later on, we're going to be doing stuff with dust. And for the dust, I had to make the dust really tiny so it fit the scene. It doesn't really matter and you can't really tell, but it's definitely unprofessional not to make your scene to scale. So I made a mistake and I wanted to warn you in advance that I will figure that out later, but I'm not going to correct it for this series. All right, so before we continue, we need to save our scene. So to save this, we're going to use a typical VFX convention. This would be the project name. So in this case, we're just going to use our class, but usually it's a 3-letter or 4-letter prefix, and then the season, and then the episode number if you're doing episodic television. For film, I'm not sure. I've never really worked on film, but most of my stuff is being for television. So usually that's the convention. Next, we would have the sequence name, which is usually just a bunch of numbers. And then we have the shot number or shot name. So in this case, it's just landing, but usually it would be numbers and sometimes letters. Then we have the version number. So once that is all good, we can click save. And the next part of this is what is called staging or layout. So if you are at a bigger company, there'll sometimes be dedicated roles for this. The idea is quickly get something together, someone who knows a little bit more about what the scene is supposed to look like, and then can pass that off to an animator. So the animator can look at how it's staged and go like, okay, I'll make that look a lot better, but I get it now, okay? If you are at a smaller place or you just don't have the time, often you will not have that. But even for you guys, this is a useful technique to use to quickly iterate through versions and establish what the shot is going to look like. Sometimes you'll have a storyboard, which in my case is very rare. Like I've very rarely got a storyboard. So sometimes the storyboard is never done, or sometimes if it is done, by the time it gets to you, it's changed so much that it's useless and they never updated the storyboard. So sometimes they'll send you one, but more often than not, the client will just say something like, hey, we want the Razor Crest to be landing, and it's going to have some like cliffs or cave or something behind it, and it's going to be landing into this like crevice, and then there's like a cave or something. I don't know, like some kind of environment, but we know that it's going to be about 8 seconds long. The camera is going to be pointing up, and then it's going to track the Razor Crest landing. Okay. And then you're like, okay, 8 seconds, it's about 200 frames. So I'll just do something that's 200 frames. You can take a look at it and see if it's in the right direction. What you don't want to do is spend 20, 30 hours working on a really beautiful shot that's rendered to perfection, and then the client say, that's not at all what we wanted. So usually you do these quick mock-ups just so you can kind of block out how everything is going to work. This is very useful for you, very useful for a creative director or you're a team lead or something like that. Sometimes the client will understand what they're looking at as well, but usually the clients are like, it's not really going to look that bad, is it? So it just depends on the industry, but it's very useful before it even gets to the client, okay? So that's what we're going to be doing at this point. All right, so in order to do that properly, what we're going to want to do here is first, we want to kind of create some very, very rough geometry for where our environment's going to go. So I kind of imagine that the Razor Crest is going to be surrounded in like a cliff or something, or cliffs on either side, or just rocks or whatever. So to mimic that, we're just going to grab a cylinder. On the cylinder, we're going to drag this out something like this. I'm going to go to face mode, select just the top faces, pull this up, and then I'm going to delete the top faces. And because our camera is going to go inside this somewhere, we probably want to maybe make that just a tad bit bigger, like that. And then we want to flip the normal. So on the modeling shelf, you want to go to mesh display, reverse, like that. And then this is not necessary, but just so we remind ourselves, and if a client did look at this or our creative director looked at this, you can see that, hey, this is not actually going to be a perfect cylinder. It's not like a man-made object. It's going to be some kind of cliff or something. So we're just going to roughen this up just a little bit, just so it doesn't look so perfect. I'm going to lower this part because our camera is going to be closer to here. And I don't really know what's going there yet, but something like this is perfectly acceptable. Maybe we'll make that a little bit spikier like that. Okay, cool. Looks a bit awkward, but there you go. Next, we need another camera. So for this part, I actually want to have two views open. So I can right click on this right here, and then I could do two panes side by side. So you get your screen divided into two sections vertically or stacked. So they're on top. I'm going to do side by side. And this is going to duplicate our view, which is fine. But on the right-hand side, I want to do a new camera. So I can do create camera, or I could simply right-click over this camera icon and then just do a new perspective camera. So on the new perspective, we can name this camera 1. I just think that's a little bit easier rather than having a new camera at the origin and then having to reposition it every time. It's a little bit more efficient just to do this. Okay, so next what we're going to do, I think the best way to do this is do this in reverse. So we're going to find where the ship needs to be at the very end and find where our camera needs to be at the very end, and then we'll go the other direction when it's going to be in the air. I think that's usually the best approach. If you try to do it the other way around, like starting as the ship is coming down, like in the air there, it can be a little bit harder because the most important part of the composition is going to be where the ship is at the end. So I'm going to switch to my camera here. I'm going to click on the resolution gate, and then I can just orient this in a position where I'm happy with it. So in terms of composition, we want to make sure that the ship is well centered in frame in this case. Because it's going to be occupying so much of the frame, we don't really need to worry about rule of thirds and all that. You could start to break the image down a little bit and be like, well, the cockpit would intersect a rule of thirds, and so would the engine. The main subject here is the ship, and for it to be kind of well balanced, we probably want the engines to be, screen right or screen left or whatever. You could flip this around; it wouldn't matter if your ship was pointing screen left to screen right. This is going from screen right to screen left in terms of where the guns are pointing and the cockpit is. But composition is not that difficult, but there are a few rules. Like, for example, you wouldn't want to have anything that's near the edges or touching the edge. Like, you can see the engine there is touching the edge of the frame. That looks really bad. You never want to do that. You also don't want to make it so interior forms, like the gun, for instance, you wouldn't want that to be like right at the edge of the ship, like right here, because that looks really, really awkward right at this section there. You want to make sure that everything is far away from an edge, like where the main forms are far away. This allows you to zoom in with your camera or cut in post if you needed to. And it also allows you to do things like camera shake. And we'll talk a little bit about camera shake later. We'll be doing that in After Effects. We won't be doing that in Maya. Okay, so I think this is going to look pretty good. I think actually what we might want to do is, I think I'm just going to tilt the camera down just a little bit. The Razor Crest looks a lot more intimidating, more impressive if we kind of look up. And because we're going through the floor here, I'm going to just lower this whole thing down a little bit. And then we'll add some rocks or something so it's landing on like some kind of platform. And then for the focal length, should have done this earlier, but if we select our camera, go to the attribute editor, I think 35 is a little bit too zoomed in. So I'm going to do 24. Now in the previous lecture, we talked about if you are shooting a plane that's in the air, you'd have to be in another plane or some other aircraft would have to be filming it, regardless of whether it's like a drone or an actual cameraman hanging out of a helicopter or whatever, or in another plane. Because this is simply landing, you could just put a stationary camera there. It's not really going to be in the way of harming anyone or anything. And I'm thinking about this again, if this was a real life shot, like an on-set thing where a real aircraft was landing. Doesn't tend to happen very much anymore, but it can still happen with like helicopters and stuff like that. But a 24 is going to be a very common focal length, and it's going to add quite a bit of distortion to the Razor Crest. So we're going to get a bit more foreshortening, and I think it's actually going to be to our advantage here. I think it's going to look pretty cool in the frame, and I'm happy with that. Okay, I'm going to select the camera, click S, because we want to make sure that is keyframed there, and I'm going to click S on the Razor Crest as well. And one thing I just realized is we probably don't want that to end right at frame 200. Let's move in like a second or so. So we'll do something like 76. Let's move that keyframe over. And on the camera, we'll do the same thing. So we have like 1 second of a lock off. And a lock off means the camera's not moving. And then we can go all the way to the very beginning and grab the Razor Crest. And then we'll just lift this up. I'll go to my channel box so I can see all of the transforms. I'll lift that up just a little bit. And then I think I might rotate this around. Something more like that. And then we've got the ship kind of landing down. Something similar to that. But now, of course, at the beginning, we don't see any of that in frame. So let's take our camera. And at the very beginning, we're just going to rotate that up like this. And I think what I'm going to have to do is actually lift this whole thing up a little bit, but we'll see how this goes. So that looks good there. It goes out of frame, but that's fine. But in terms of the overall speed, I'm pretty happy with it. I think we are going to actually have to lift this up a little bit, rotate this back down. All right, so now we're going to go to the point where the ship gets pretty far out of frame. And that's going to be our cue to where we need to add another keyframe, much like we did with rotoscoping or just general in-betweening. We'll pull this up, and now that will be in frame for the whole time. And then we could add some extra adjustments after we've kind of played around with how the Razor Crest is actually going to land. So for the Razor Crest itself, we could go to something like 50 frames or so in, and then we could just make some tweaks to it. Like we could just have it tilt a little bit more. Maybe you can tilt forward a little bit. We want to give it maybe a little bit of turbulence, and we could do that with an expression. But we might be able to get away without having to do that on this. We could either tilt the nose down a little bit as it's coming in, and then just before it lands, what we probably want to do is either have it almost hover for a little bit before it hits the surface. Have it just go up a little bit, like maybe a little bit more. Could flare it back just a little bit. I'll move this keyframe over. And then here it's going to flare up, and then it's going to hit back down. All right, so now let's play this in real time to see how this looks. So if you were to play this directly, it's going to go like super fast, which is not following 24 FPS. And we can only see one view at a time. So if you go to your animation preferences button, it's like the guy running away from the gear. For the playback, let's do 24 FPS times 1. And then for the update view, we'll say all. So now when we scrub, all of the views update. And then if we play it, it's going to play in real time. If you have a very heavy scene, sometimes it will jump frames and not be able to hit them all. So that's why the play every frame button is available. But for this, there's not a lot going on in the scene, so this should be pretty manageable. All right, so it looks fine, except for this part here where it kind of pops up. It's a little bit awkward. So I'm going to stop the animation, select back on the Razor Crest. Then it's this part right here. So let's actually pull all of these out this way, because I want to have a little handle at the end where it's just going to be pretty still. something more like that. And then as it comes in, it kind of eases in, but we can imagine that when the camera starts rolling, but when the shot starts, the Razor Crest is already going down at a pretty fast speed. So let's go to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, and then we'll go to the Translate Y. And instead of easing this, we're just going to have that linear to begin with. So it's already coming down pretty quickly. And then it can land. If that looks a little bit too fast, what we could do here, we could ease that a little bit more. So we could pull this down. So it's going to slow into that. I think that might look a little bit better. So just scrubbing through that. That looks a little bit better. And now the camera gets a little bit out of alignment. So at frame 96, we need to just rotate that to keep it in frame. And we want to actually keep a little bit more on the top than the bottom. So notice there's more, we would be able to see more sky or more cliff or whatever we have there. All right, so that looks okay for like a super rough draft. And then you would play blast this, show it to somebody, and then they would be like, oh, okay, yeah, it looks good or whatever. And then you could do, extra motion as the ship lands. So for example, we could detach these, something that we probably want to do back in our reference. I think I might actually want to do that, just to detach this part from the gear. So then we can actually show the gear kind of like pushing down a little bit. I think that might look kind of cool. I don't want to go as far as creating a rig for it. So like as the ship comes down, I want it to kind of do like a little bit of a bounce right there. It's very subtle. But the way the hierarchy is set up here doesn't really lend itself to be able to do that easily. Let's go back to the scene that we're referencing. So we can take the windows, main engines, the guns, the top engine covers, all the stuff except for the gear, essentially. And then we can attach this to the main body. So attaching that to the main body means that we still can move everything around just like we could before, no problem. But now we can take the entire Razor Crest and just do like a little bump thing like that. So some things that we probably would want to fix, we'd want to fix the fact that this should kind of react a little bit. All of this should be grigged, but for the purposes of this assignment, let's not worry about that. And we're actually going to be compositing some dust over this. So we're probably not really going to see it either. Let's just see if we can get by without having to do that. The important thing is, though, we do want to have this main body include all of the extra bits that are attached to it. That's going to make our life a little bit easier. So let's save that. And we'll go back to our main shot here. Go to File, Reference Editor, and then we'll just right click and then reload the reference. So now when you select it, you can see that the whole thing has been altered a little bit. But nothing else changes, like the rest of the animation is still good. So as this comes to land, and just so this is a little bit more clear, I'm going to grab another cylinder. And we're going to place a cylinder where the Razor Crest is going to be landing on. It could just be a raised piece of terrain or some extra rocks or something. Not really going to be a perfect platform, but it does need to be on a level like this. Some kind of like higher part, because we want the camera to be allowed to go a little bit lower without having to worry about clipping through the floor. All right, so as the Razor Crest comes down like this, I actually pull this forward a few frames. Then we can select the Razor Crest body itself. Go to frame 172-ish, click S. We can go forward, let's say 4 frames. We could even tilt that down just a little bit like that. There goes. That's actually a lot of rotation. Didn't mean to do it that much. Something like that. And then we'll copy this keyframe. Just shift select it, right click copy, and then we'll go forward, say 184. paste. That looks a little bit fast. Pull this one out a little bit. And then maybe this one will have that pretty slow. And that looks a little bit like it's easing into it, but really it shouldn't ease into it. It's going pretty quickly. So it needs to be ramped up at the beginning. So we'll go back to our graph editor. We can go to the rotate X, grab that keyframe, and then just rotate this up like this. So now notice that when it lands, it doesn't ease into it. It's already going pretty quickly. So as soon as that goes down, that's also going to bounce a little bit. We could actually take all these keyframes and just nudge them over by a frame or two. And I think I might actually want to just extenuate that just a little bit more. We could even just give it a little bit of a rock motion to that. One thing that helps if it's going way too quickly is to drag your mouse over, and then you have a little bit more control if your mouse is further away from the gizmo when you rotate. So you just need to play around with it and find something that works for you. You go back to our camera here. And we can see it does that little rock. That's still a little bit too much. I don't want to go that crazy with it. So on the rotate Z here, I'm just going to do -1. And it's still a little bit laggy, like we would expect that to be a little bit quicker. Let's move that back by just a few frames. That looks better. Something more like that. Now the Razor Crest as a whole is going by pretty slowly here. And at this point, at around frame 96, I think I want a different view of this. I think I want something that's like this. And then here, I think it could be flared back just a little bit more. It can hit the ground like that. Okay, so something like this I think is pretty good for a rough draft. You would basically just play blast this out if you were doing this for real. For me, I don't need to see this ever unless you want to show me it. It's just, it's basically just for you, just so you can get something that looks pretty good. I am going to make one more adjustment before we move on. And I'm going to take the camera and then just rotate that down just a little bit there. So it's kept more in frame. And later on we can smooth out this animation, but I think for right now, I think this looks okay. It's enough for us to move on to the next part. All right, so let's save this, and now let's do some really, really quick lighting just to get the overall idea of what this is going to be. So for a lot of lighting, it's really nothing that complicated. It's just an HDR or a sunlight. You can also use a combination of the two. In this case, I am going to use a sun because I do want this to be sky, and I think that would be more useful. Now it's up to you if you want to use an HDR or if you want to go do something with sunlight. I don't really care for this as long as it looks good, but I'm just going to set up a quick V-Ray sun. And before we do that, we do need to change our renderer from Arnold to V-Ray, so don't forget to do that. And then in overrides, I'm going to go down to environment. I'm going to create a sun and create sky. And then for this next part, I'm going to turn off this button right here, which is the gate mask. So this is useful to see what the camera is going to see, but I also want to see more of the viewport as well. And then I'm going to turn on the V-Ray viewport IPR, just so we can see this kind of work in real time, and close to real time. Before we do that though, don't forget, we need to change our camera to a V-Ray physical camera. So attributes, V-Ray physical camera. And then in the extra V-Ray attributes, we have those controls there. In this case, I don't really care about any of those other settings for right now. I just want to move the sun. Okay, so the idea for this, we want to create some kind of dramatic lighting or just something that's a little bit more interesting. I don't really want to see it in the viewport. And it could be fairly low. I'm not really sure how wide we want this to go. And honestly, we could actually make this cave area or these rock areas just a little bit larger. Let's space that out a little bit. That's going to give us a little bit more room to play with. And pull this up a little bit. Scale that up a little bit more. Just so we can see what the light would be blocking, basically. So let's progress just a little bit further into the animation where the ship turns. I think I'll raise that sun out. But basically, you just want to place this somewhere just to get a good idea of kind of what you're thinking. We could do something more evening. That would be fine too. We don't want to have it super dark though. And we don't necessarily want to see the sun. It just depends. But something like this would be pretty useful. I'm going to turn that off now. And then later on, we will do a lot more with the lighting. But for right now, I think we are in a good position. All right, in the next video, we're going to actually make our environment look a lot nicer with proper assets. All right, see you guys in the next video.